Hello, this is Rodney McAlpin. I'm here at the Harley-Davidson shop in Jackson, Mississippi. The owner is Earl Rotman. He also owns this Henderson that we restored. It took 4 years and 9 months to do the restoration. The purpose of this video is to give you some idea of all the work it takes to make this thing happen. This motorcycle is a 1924-28 Excelsior Henderson Deluxe.
In 2019, I received a phone call from Earl Rotman, owner of the Harley shop and the Henderson you see here in the picture. He asked me if I would like to put the bike back together as it had been delivered, dismantled, and some work done to it, and never touched, and that was 20 years ago. After some assurances that once the project was started, it wouldn't be started and stopped, and started and stopped, and that there'd be money enough in there to do the work properly, I agreed to do the work under one condition, and that was that it had to look good and run good. The original request was that I only get the bike running, and it was worth too much money just to stop at that point. When Earl got the bike, it was one ride away from the scrapyard. It was in very, very rough condition. The only reason he kept it is he thought it was an Indian. He always wanted an Indian. Well, it turns out it's a 1924-28 Excelsior Henderson, and it was in very rough shape. I never saw the bike fully assembled, as you just saw in those pictures. When I started the project, it was scattered all over the back of a repair shop, and it was in a million pieces. The fenders were all broken, the sheet metal work was horrible. They were all bent up, dinged, and tore up. The gas tank was so full of dents I didn't even know if we could salvage it. There was no paint left on the bike anywhere to be found that I could see when we first started. The wheels were all rusted, the spoke nipples were all stuck, couldn't be saved. The hubs were wrong on the front. In fact, it had a complete Harley front wheel on it off of something like a UL. The axle was way too small and too light for this bike. The hand shift that was on the bike was not correct. It was a piece of junk from an old Harley that somebody made fit. It didn't work very well at all. The pieces we had that went with the bike were very corroded. They were aluminum and could not be saved. The part you're looking at is the hand shifter guide and brake guide that mounts on the side of the tank. This is some of the stuff that could not be saved and had to be refabricated. Next up is the frame, which was sandblasted and powder coated, along with some other parts including front end parts and the handlebars, and then some miscellaneous seat parts. All these sandblasted and powder coated before I took over the project. Well, the first thing I did was went to the sandblaster and bead blasted all the parts that we had that looked like they could be salvaged. Here we have the front fender, the rear fender, both wheels, the original rear wheel, and the front wheel assembly that was off of the Harley before I realized it was off a Harley. And they all been sandblasted and cleaned up at this point. After bead blasting, both fenders, front and rear, had to have all the brackets on them removed. They all had to be welded up, filled, and ready for paint. On the front fender, we even had to make new skirts for both sides. After all the sheet metal work was done, very little body filler was needed to make the paint smooth. The horn mounted on the top of the front fender caused it to be broken. When we repaired it, we added extra reinforcement underneath the front fender for a horn should we decide to put one on it. The next two shots are of the rear fender after the body filler and the metal work had been completed and it was ready for paint. Here again, very little body filler was needed on the rear fender. After the restoration was well underway, we happened to find a postcard in a catalog of the bike you see here. It's an exact duplicate of the bike that we're building, even down to the Model T headlight that didn't come on the bike originally. The taillight bracket had to be made from scratch. All we had were some pictures. I think it turned out pretty well. A little later, the taillight was swapped out for one that was a little more vintage. It had the word stop written in it when you applied the brake. Well, at this stage of the game, the fenders have been primed, and we started to mock up assembly to make sure all the holes were where they needed to be, things of that nature. The seat springs had been fabricated, the seat hoop was made, and the exhaust had been rebuilt. After all the tins had been primed, a black base coat was put on them. This took quite a bit of time, as each coat of paint had to be wet sanded, and that took about a day for each one of the fenders and for the tank. After the black base coats were sanded to satisfaction, 3 coats of color were put on each one of the parts. Next came 2 coats of clear, and then the pinstriping was applied. I used gold pinstriping tape simply because I'm just not that good with a pinstriping brush. After the pinstripes and the decals were applied, 6 coats of clear were painted on each part. After every 2 coats, it was wet sanded until the stripes could barely be felt. After each piece had its last coat of clear, they were wet sanded all the way from 600 grit down to 2000 grit. After the wet sanding was complete, each part was buffed using a foam wheel and 3 grades of polishing compound: fine, extra fine, and then a mirror finish. Each part took roughly a month to complete. Here you see the finished tank. You'll also see the stainless steel lever guides that go on the side of the tank that were hand built. The bottom of the gas tank, signed and dated to commemorate when the work was done and who did it. After each part was completed, it was retrial fitted back on the bike. In the next 2 pictures, you'll see the trial fitting process, which also included the seat that we had modified and reupholstered to match the original seat that was on the bike. Now the bodywork was pretty much complete, and we were able to move on to the engine rebuild. In the next 4 shots, you're going to see the shifter guide that goes on the side of the gas tank and 2 levers. One is the brake stay, the other is the shifter lever. Well, we used stainless steel for these parts. The originals were steel that were painted and chrome plated. We don't have a chrome shop in the Jackson, Mississippi area, so we used the stainless and polished it. I think it turned out pretty well. On the gas tank, you'll see how it mocked up. The tape was to keep things from rubbing as we fitted them on. Okay, next you're going to see the rear brake assembly, which is a band brake, unlike the front brake, which was a shoe brake like you see on modern bikes. The rear brake also had the capability of having a shoe brake on the inside of the brake drum and the band brake that worked together when you had a sidecar. All of these parts were bead blasted and then black powder coated because it would hold up so much better than the paint. In case you were wondering how we dated the engine, we used this engine sandcasting number. It was verified from Mike Smith in Montana, who's an expert on these things, and he said it was a 24 model. Turns out the wheels were a bit of a challenge. They were individual and specialized for the Henderson. The rims were bead blasted, cleaned up, sanded, powder coated, and the powder coat color was determined to be cream colored, not yellow as you see on a lot of other bikes. The cream color was in the chart, so was the color of the bike. It turns out they made several different colored motorcycles. They made black, red, yellow, and blue being the most prominent. When you restore an old motorcycle, there are a lot of parts that you have to get rid of because they weren't right, they were broken or worn out. The clutch spring you see and the front sprocket were both bad and needed to be replaced. The front sprocket was actually the wrong size for the bike. Not only was the sprocket the wrong size, it wasn't even the original sprocket. Someone welded a sprocket on the original sprocket so they'd have a hub that would fit the bike. Another part we didn't have was the front brake stay. I borrowed this from Mike in Montana and then made one from scratch that we now have on the bike. Well, here we are, now on the engine. This is the way I found the engine when I started the project. It was laying on a bench, all half taken apart, and nasty as all get out. Here with the oil pan removed, you can just see how cruddy the engine actually was. The first thing we did was pressure washed it, scrubbed it, and tried to clean it up as best we could. Here we have a side view of the engine before we started dismantling it further. On the engine, the first thing I did was created a cradle assembly to go on my engine stand so I could bolt the engine to it to make it easier to access all the internal workings of the motor. By this time, we were 2 years plus into the project. The engine stand that we made was used throughout the rest of the build, and we actually used it to start the engine on for its first test run. Now the engine was completely dismantled, all the parts were inspected, labeled, and put away for future repair. As we began to tear the engine down, one of the things of most concern was that this engine has windage trays around the connecting rods. A lot of the screws were broken off, and none of them were wired like they were supposed to be. After the block was thoroughly stripped and the heads and the crankshaft were removed, along with the transmission gears, it was completely cleaned and bead blasted. After the thorough cleaning and bead blasting, repair on the block began. A lot of the screws had to be drilled out, some even tapped, others had to be drilled and completely helicoiled, just to hold the windage trays in. There was also one broken stud on one of the cylinders. Not all the gaskets came off with the bead blaster. They had to be scraped off. They were really hard and very difficult to get off. It's a picture of the timing gear set before it was bead blasted and before it was dismantled. It was pretty cruddy. The oil pan before it was bead blasted and cleaned. The timing gear cover being cleaned and dismantled. The cylinders were bead blasted, and then several of the fins on each one of the cylinders had to be rebuilt with brass. After the cylinders were bead blasted, a lot of work had to be done. The valve guides had to be replaced, the valves had to be replaced, the cylinders had to be bored, and then a lot of the broken fins that were on it also had to be replaced. All the work on the cylinders took approximately 6 months to complete. Now this is a timing gear cover after it had been bead blasted and cleaned with the oil pump reinstalled. As we tore the engine down, we mic'd the pistons, checked the connecting rods, and determined that the pistons had to be replaced. We had to order new ones, but we couldn't do it until the cylinders were bored so we'd know the diameter of the new pistons. We also found on the pistons that 3 of them had the same wrist pin size and one was oddball and larger. So that meant they all had to have new wrist pins. It took about 3 weeks before we found a company that would manufacture pistons for us. It turns out it was C&P Pistons out of California. Well, the new pistons finally came. You must admit they looked really nice. But while we were waiting on them, there was plenty of other work to be done, such as fitting the crank and the crank bearings to the case, wiring the screws, putting in the windage trays, fitting the transmission bearings, repairing the clutch. There was lots of work to do. Back in the 20s, they didn't have things such as Loctite. All the screws were drilled and were wired in place as you would find on an aircraft. And this took a good little bit of time to do. In the video, you can see the windage tray screws being wired. You have to pay attention to which way the wire is being wrapped around the head of the screw so that the wire doesn't unwind when the screw loosens. On the Henderson engine, it didn't use normal bearings like you'd see today. It used Babbitt bearings. The crankshaft looked fine, but the bearings were somewhat scored, so all the bearings had to be scraped to fit the crankshaft and to fit in the case at the same time. Just fitting the bearings and the crank in the case took about a week and a half. After the crank was fully installed, the rest of the engine was reassembled using the new parts and the remanufactured parts that we had. This took quite a while. A lot of the parts had to be fit 2 or 3 times in order to get the correct clearances. Even though we had all the manuals we could buy and find, the clearances were a bit of a question mark. A lot of the stuff just had to be hand fit till it felt like it was supposed to be. The new pistons and rings were slipped onto the connecting rods. The cylinders, which had recently been bored and freshened up, were slipped onto the pistons. Then those were slipped down into the block for final installation. Here you can see the cylinders installed onto the block. Now it's on to the gear train. With the crankshaft positioned at top dead center and the timing mark in the crankcase hole, the gears for the valve train and the ignition timing were installed onto the proper shafts. There was a lot of slack in these gears because they were 100 years old, which made it very difficult to get the timing dialed in. Once the valve timing and ignition timing gears were installed, the engine was flipped over and then rotated through to check for clearances and binding that may have occurred after those installations were completed. After everything checked out, rotating the motor, we moved on to the transmission. The transmission is a 3-speed manual transmission with no synchronizers. That means when you shift gears, they tend to have a grinding sound. The transmission shafts in play were set using the brass fittings you see with the holes in them and screwing them in and out to obtain the correct clearance on the bevel gears you see behind the flywheel. After all the internal parts were assembled in the engine, next came the oil pan, the gear cover on the front of the motor, the intake manifold, the carburetor, and the exhaust manifold. Now, the carburetor you see in the picture is a Zenith carburetor, but it's not the Zenith carburetor that should have been on the motorcycle. We opted for a more modern Mueller carburetor, which is all aluminum and much lighter, and therefore protects the flanges on the intake manifold. Next up is the video of the engine running on a test stand. These were in an earlier video we posted right after we got the engine running. This is a good shot of the Marvel Schuler carburetor we found and are using on the engine now. It works really well. We ran that engine a total of over 2 hours on that engine test stand, ran it high and low, and as luck would have it, we decided it was time to put it in the frame. We did, we cranked it, and then shortly after it started, the number 4 connecting rod broke. The connecting rod broke right below the wrist pin. It didn't blow the block up, but it did score the cylinder. It messed up the piston also. We ordered a new cylinder and a new connecting rod from our man in Montana, and we got exactly what we had. We had to rebuild them both and make the rod fit the crank, but as a result, we had what we needed to put it back together. Total time for this project was 3 years and 9 months. That's just reference for those who want to start a project like this. It takes a lot of time. Well, the next little video is what we did. It was the first test ride that we did for the bike after it was all said and done. I hope you enjoyed this video. Following this video of the test ride will be some shots of the people who were involved with the bike that helped along the way. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you much. See you on the next video. Well, now for the credits. First off, Earl Rotman, proud owner of the bike and the Harley shop in Jackson, Mississippi. Now, myself, Rodney McAlpin, and Earl. Jimmy, sales rep for the Harley shop in Jackson, Mississippi. Chris, mechanic for the Harley shop, Jackson, Mississippi. Homer, shop foreman for the Harley shop, Jackson, Mississippi. Lastly, our photographer, Rick, of Rick's Photos. Thank you very much, Rick.